This story opens with a wall plastered with photos and evidence of everyone who has ever been hunted by the Punisher, a man who has devoted his entire life to bringing the wicked to justice. Many of these portraits have an X carved into the faces, a grim sign that they are already 6 feet under. For Frank Castle, this means the job is done, leaving him temporarily without a clear purpose to follow. It is a haunting visual representation of a completed checklist written in blood. A few moments later, Frank Castle himself appears, our protagonist, radiating the terrifying presence and raw strength that define him as one of the most famous anti-heroes in the franchise. Frank doesn't believe in doing good through the system or sending criminals to jail. His role is far more drastic. The only criminal who can't cause harm is one who isn't breathing. To face the city's most cold-blooded predators, he must stay in peak condition. He spends a vast portion of his life working out until his hands bleed and his body hits its absolute limit. There is no better motivation to exercise at an unhealthy intensity than staring at a wall of people you put in the ground. Evil individuals whose own actions led them to that point and whom you finally managed to stop. After a successful workout fueled by a couple of energy drinks mixed with whiskey, there's nothing like getting back to the grind. But with no criminals left to hunt, Frank finds himself spiraling into frustration, eventually tearing down his wall of trophies in a fit of rage, desperate to replace those old faces with fresh targets. At that moment, the scene shifts to show a city in total freefall. Riots are breaking out in the streets, and people are livid over the rising crime wave tearing through the local neighborhoods. The police have been completely useless, and in the vacuum of power, many young people have decided to take the law into their own hands. But, as expected, where there are well-meaning kids, there are also predators who exploit the protests to loot small businesses and prey on the innocent, hijacking what was supposed to be a movement for peace and justice. Through radio and TV broadcasts, those who are too terrified to step outside plead for a miracle, someone or something that can stop this wave of violence. Everyone is at each other's throats, and the city has turned into a total living hell. The balance has been completely shattered. The mobs that once controlled the neighborhoods and maintained a tense peace in exchange for a monthly cut have gone to war with rival gangs from across the city. This territorial conflict has left innocent bystanders and hardworking people caught in the middle of a relentless crossfire. That morning, we follow a homeless man named Eddie who managed to scrap together some food to share with his beloved dog, Camo. But as he searches for a quiet spot to sit and eat in peace, he's targeted by a pack of violent punks. The thugs kicked him square in the face while he was just trying to feed his dog. They were live streaming their twisted antics, cruel, mindless destruction, but the worst thing they did was steal Camo. While the leader of the group pretended to pet the dog with fake affection, his true, sinister intentions began to surface. Eddie begged and screamed at the top of his lungs, pleading with them not to hurt his best friend. Moments later, a garbage truck rounded the corner. The final seconds of Camo's life were spent receiving affection from the very boy who, the second he saw his chance, hurled the poor dog under the heavy wheels. Eddie's gut-wrenching scream could be heard blocks away. His best friend was dead, sacrificed for 10 seconds of cheap thrills by evil, soulless people. Making matters worse, the bystanders walking by did absolutely nothing. They simply looked away and hurried off to avoid getting involved. The city had devolved into a concrete jungle where it was every man for himself, and nobody had the basic decency to stop for a second and think about what they were doing. At that point, we cut back to Frank, sitting alone in the middle of a room, haunted by memories of all the brothers in arms he has lost. He recounts a few of the traumas he's endured as a result of the violent path he chose. Frank recites the Marine Corps mantra over and over like a prayer, while the ghosts of his old squad torment him. After a few tense moments, he carves an X over the tattoo that identified him for years as a man who fought for his country, a man who now feels he has nothing left. The ghost of his friend Curtis is the most compassionate of the bunch. He's the only one who doesn't constantly haunt him with guilt. Instead, he tries to check in on Frank, asking how he's holding up and offering at least one piece of advice that might actually be useful. A few minutes later, Frank grabs a suitcase and packs it with weapons, not to head into battle, but to lock it up and hide it away in a secured locker. After stashing his belongings in a safe spot, he leaves his home to walk the streets and witness the pandemonium unfolding everywhere. At the same time, we visit a nearby coffee shop owned by a man named Dre, who grinds every day with the sole motivation of providing everything for his young daughter, Charlie. On this particular day, a crazed guy high on drugs wanders into the shop and and demands a cup of coffee. Dre is used to handling these types of characters, so he calmly tells the man to get in line and he'll get his coffee, just like usual. Right then, a news report flashes on the TV announcing that the Gnucci crime family has been completely slaughtered. With them gone, only a few small-time criminal crews are left to fight over the territory where they live. A moment later, we discover the root of Frank's trauma. He was the one who wiped out the Gnucci family. Now, he feels responsible for the city turning into a living hell. Though the Gnuccis ran an extortion racket, they maintained a level of order that has now completely shattered. 2 seconds later, Frank steps into the coffee shop, grabs the coffee intended for the crazed man, and heads back out to drink it in peace for a moment. As he walks away, he can hear the man ranting about how the monsters are coming for him and that they live inside the walls. Meanwhile, in the background, the same punks who killed Camo are seen jumping a man and robbing him of everything he owns, while the police do absolutely nothing to stop them. The very same police officer who tried to escape the riot earlier is now visible on a corner, being brutally attacked by several thugs while his patrol car is torched. Throughout this entire display of destruction, abuse, and violence, Frank keeps walking as if none of it matters. After several minutes, a luxury car passes dangerously close to him and slows down right as it pulls alongside. Frank notices this immediately, knowing he needs to stay sharp. Eventually, he reaches his destination, the local cemetery, where his wife and daughter are buried. There, he leaves the key to the locker where he stashed his guns and takes a quiet moment to talk to them. Frank asks his wife if she's still by his side or if she has drifted too far away. Even though he swore he would never give up and never leave her alone, he knows he broke that promise, and the weight of that failure eats him alive. He admits he's exhausted, that he just wants to surrender and finally be with them. Through his tears, he pulls a gun from his pocket and presses it against his head, ready to end the pain. With the barrel against his temple, he has a vision of his daughter waving from the stairs, one of the few happy memories he can still see clearly. He also remembers his son swimming in the pool, calling out for him to join the fun. But these moments of bliss quickly turn into nightmares as blood begins to pour from his wife and children, reminding him of the horrific way they died. The agony hits him all at once like an avalanche. Frank snaps his eyes open for a second, and his daughter's image is standing right there in front of him, causing him to drop the gun in shock. She looks far more angelic than in his visions, and though she doesn't speak, she greets him with pure love. It's a sign enough for Frank to realize this isn't the way to go, though he's left enraged by how fleeting the moment truly is. On the way back home, Frank spots that luxury car following him again. As he cuts through a deserted alley, he's hit by a sudden vision of himself wearing the Punisher suit. Just before he can reach his apartment building, a woman in a wheelchair appears and greets him. When Frank scans the area, he realizes he's completely surrounded by guys on motorcycles. It's clear he's walked right into a trap. The woman starts telling him a story, explaining how her entire family was wiped off the face of the earth with extreme cruelty. She reveals that her husband, Benny, was the first to go. She recalls how he came home the night before he died, reeking of cigarettes and cheap perfume from some woman he'd met. Even though she'd given up on the idea of loyalty a long time ago, he was still her husband, and his death cut her deep. Her son Bobby was next. Someone slit his throat with an axe while he was out with his wife. Then they went after her second son, Eddie, riddling him with machine gun fire outside a club. By some stroke of luck, her grandkids had already gone inside and managed to survive the hit. The last one to die was her prince, her most cherished son, young Carlo. The last thing she remembers from the hit where her little boy perished was the time on the car's clock, 6:47. Those 3 digits were seared into her brain, and she has been repeating them for months like a perpetual sentence. As the old woman recounts the deaths of her entire family, Frank realizes he remembers every single one of them vividly because he was the executioner. She is talking about the Gnucci family, the same family he slaughtered in cold blood during his path of vengeance. Standing before him is the mob matriarch, now confined to a wheelchair and flanked by a couple of thugs who would surely sell her out for 10% more than she's paying them. After finishing her story, the woman struggles to her feet using crutches and tells Frank, with pure venom in her voice, that he is like a bloodthirsty animal that can never be satisfied. She screams that he took everything from her, yet he's still here breathing, waiting for a death he doesn't even deserve, and being punished with a loneliness that never ends. The last thing she remembers about her beloved Carlo is him telling her he loved her right before Frank crushed his skull with his boot. But now, the time has come for her to get her revenge, and she's cooked up something very interesting. This afternoon, at exactly 6:47, a massive bounty will be put on his head, and his current location will be leaked to the entire world. At the very same minute she said goodbye to her son, Frank will have to start running for his life or let himself be killed in the most painful way imaginable. She wants him to know that he didn't finish anything with what he did. Now, she has become the Punisher, and Frank is the prey. The woman pulls away with a smirk on her face, telling him she's going to love watching him die. A few seconds later, Frank, who had spent his days staring into space, is suddenly checking every corner of the building, bracing for an attack. As soon as he gets back to his apartment, he has a vision of Karen, who keeps screaming that he failed everyone, his family, his friends, and the city. But when she notices just how fragile Frank is, she reminds him that he still has a job to do. His era as the Punisher isn't over yet, and she guides him through the apartment toward the drawer where the weapons are kept. After that, a sense of pure urgency surged through the peephole of his apartment. The entire hallway was crawling with masked men armed with bats and pipes, hunting him down with the sole intent of killing him and collecting the bounty. Frank was running out of time. Even though the money couldn't be collected until after 6:47, there were plenty of people who hated him enough for who he was to do the job for free. Through the peephole, Frank watched, barred as the men hacked through his neighbor's door with a machete. The defenseless woman who lived alone with her young son, Isaiah, the boy who always greeted him whenever he left the house. Now, it was time to decide. He could stay hidden and maybe survive another hour, or he could step out and help her before she and her kid became just another statistic. The screams of the mother and her son echoed through the entire building, and seconds later, a liquid started seeping under the door. Before Frank could even process what it was, fire erupted everywhere. It was gasoline. Those thugs were planning to burn down the whole hallway if that's what it took to get to him. In less than 2 seconds, Frank's feet were engulfed in flames. It was time to react. Either drop to the floor and roll for safety, or do what he does best. To the backdrop of a classical music track, we see Frank charge forward and barrel through the door, shattering it with sheer muscle. He tears through the hallway, knife in hand, taking down half a dozen men without an ounce of mercy. Step by step, moving through Isaiah's mother's apartment, Frank walks with cold precision. He drives the blade into chests, arms, and necks until not a single one is left breathing. The moment a small window of opportunity opens, Frank barks at the family to run. Right then, a new guy, Sebi, shows up swinging a baseball bat, catching Frank in the ribs and landing a couple more heavy blows. But Frank recovers instantly and launches a counterattack, crushing the man's skull with a perfectly aimed strike while dodging an axe swing from a guy trying to sneak up behind him. With a momentary victory in his hands, Frank thought it was over. But that was when a gunshot rang out from the hallway, followed by the scream of a man who had just been dropped dead. Immediately after, several armed men appeared, and one carrying a shotgun opened fire relentlessly throughout the apartment, trying to take our protagonist down. By using one of the henchmen as a human shield, Frank not only managed to save himself, but also seized a weapon and initiated a gunfight across the unit. He used his extensive skills to pick them off one by one until the shotgun ran dry, at which point he swapped it for a sawed-off that had just arrived in the fray. He unleashed a bloodbath throughout the area, firing point blank at their faces regardless of the weapon's caliber, ending the skirmish with a massive explosion from a grenade they failed to toss successfully. At that moment, Frank took a second to look out the window and realized the entire building was under siege. People were being dragged from their homes, and many were being hurled off their balconies into the void. The mercenaries knew Frank lived there, but since they didn't have his exact apartment number, they had triggered total chaos to flush him out. Before another innocent person could be murdered, Frank used the final shell in his shotgun to save them, sniping the thug from a floor above. He then dropped down to the lower level to snatch the dead man's gun and begin a trail of destruction to tip the scales back in his favor. One by one, the mercenaries who crossed his path caught a bullet. Every shot fired meant the rescue of an innocent person about to meet a grisly end. The thugs didn't care about killing each other as long as Frank went down. After all, only one person could claim the bounty, and there's no such thing as loyalty among thieves and murderers. The biggest problem was that there was no time to reload, so every criminal who hit the dirt had to provide a fresh weapon to replace the old one. Using a high-caliber rifle, Frank saved a girl's life just as she was about to be tossed from the top floor, landing a perfect headshot on a target from a massive distance. However, that split-second distraction almost got him killed when 4 guys coming out of the elevator nearly took him out. He managed to recover and kept dropping anyone who stood in his way. Knowing he couldn't fight like this forever, Frank started heading down to the lower floors, aiming to hit the street. But on the stairwell, he ran straight into an ambush and had to burn through a massive amount of ammo to keep from being sliced open by a machete. He realized then that reaching the street was impossible. There were just too many enemies, so he started heading back up, killing everyone coming down the stairs until he finally made it to the roof. Once there, he smashed the door lock and jammed it shut to buy himself at least a couple of minutes of peace. The biggest problem with being on the roof was that there wasn't just one way up, and before Frank could even get into position, dozens of guys swarmed up through both stairwells, and he was quickly running out of bullets. During a maneuver that went sideways, he took a bullet to the shoulder and had to duck into cover for a few seconds to figure out a way to get out of there alive. Unfortunately, the thugs kept coming, armed with katanas, axes, and whatever else they could get their hands on. Everyone was itching to be the one to land the finishing blow, but Frank fought with pure grit and managed to take them all down, turning many of their own weapons against them. The last man standing managed to tackle him and hurl him over the edge of the roof. However, Frank managed to squeeze off a shot while mid-air, piercing the guy's skull with a clean hit, though he ended up slamming onto an air conditioning unit and badly injuring his back. Even so, he pushed forward. He had been through way too much to die from a simple 2-story fall. The bad news was that the street still wasn't a safe bet. There were too many enemies out there, and the old woman was standing right in the middle of it all, waiting for the exact moment she'd get to watch him die. 2 seconds later, more thugs reached the roof, leaving him with no choice but to leap towards some wooden scaffolding. He took a brutal hit, but managed to land safely halfway down the side of the building. Right then, a gang leader shoved one of his own henchmen off the edge to go after him, but he aimed poorly, and the kid died on impact. After a few more seconds and a hard landing on the pavement, Frank hit the street and tried to go after the woman, but men who recognized his face kept lunging at him, forcing him to slow down to fight them off. At that exact moment, he was faced with a brand new choice. The shop belonging to Dre, the kind guy who had given him the coffee and worked every day just for his little girl, Charlie, was being raided by thugs who wanted to torch the place and kidnap his daughter. Frank had to make a call. On one side, he had the chance to kill the old woman who had put a bounty on his head. On the other, he could help an honest man who had sacrificed everything for his child. For Frank, the choice was simple. He kept walking toward the old woman. He wanted to wrap his hands around her neck and squeeze until the life drained from her eyes. But seconds later, he heard little Charlie's voice, pleading for help while her father was pinned down and beaten with a baseball bat. The way Charlie screamed "Daddy" reminded him so much of his own daughter that Frank turned back, sprinting to help them. Meanwhile, the old woman pulled away in her car, glaring at him with pure hatred, certain he wouldn't make it through the night. On his way to the coffee shop, Frank managed to knock one of the bikers working for the old woman off his ride and snatched his gun. With the weapon in hand, he took out the 4 thugs beating Dre, then stormed into the shop, executing every armed man in sight to save the family. One of the attackers ended up with a slit throat, his blood glazing the donuts Dre baked fresh every morning. The last one had his face scalded and shattered by a carafe of hot coffee Frank used as a weapon. Before Frank could make sure Charlie and her dad were truly safe, a massive Russian guy burst in. He was shirtless and armed with a knife, which he drove straight through Frank's shoulder, leaving a deep, jagged wound. The muscular, tattooed giant lunged at Frank with everything he had, twisting the knife in his existing wound to torture him and inflict maximum pain. That was when the Punisher grabbed a pen and stabbed the guy in the ribs, following up with a dozen more strikes to the neck, face, and arms until he finally put him down, leaving the giant to choke on his own blood. The gruesome, traumatic scene ended with Frank wrenching the blade out of his own shoulder and limping toward the exit of the coffee shop. Just as he reached the door, Charlie threw her arms around him, thanking him for saving her family. Dre, barely able to stand, pulled his daughter into a tight embrace and looked at Frank, offering his sincere gratitude for the rescue. In that moment, Charlie asked him to wait and handed him a rose she had made with her own hands. Her honest smile managed to soften the heart of the city's deadliest killer, if only for a second. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Frank stepped back out onto the street, where people were still looting local businesses and bodies were piling up everywhere. A few seconds later, the police finally showed up, with several cruisers arriving to tape off the scene alongside ambulances rushing to help the wounded. As for Frank, he kept walking until he reached the cemetery once again, where he cleared away all the trash that had piled up on his family's grave and placed the rose Charlie gave him on his daughter's headstone. There, he thanked his daughter for standing by him during that critical moment. A few seconds later, he realized that the key to the locker containing his uniform and weapons was still there, so he grabbed it and said aloud that maybe it was time to move forward until he could claim one last kill. In the following scene, we see the heartless punk who murdered Camo walking the streets freely, about to strike a defenseless old woman with a bat. That's when Frank, or rather, the Punisher, appears and kicks him with such brutal force that he's sent flying against a pole. He then presses a knife against the kid's eye, but just as he's about to finish him, Eddie shows up and begs him not to get any blood on his cap. The boy, terrified and proving to be the coward he really is, hands the cap back without hesitation. However, once Eddie reveals to Frank exactly what the kid did to his dog, Frank spins around and hurls an axe straight into his back before he can make a run for it. The special comes to a close with a powerful shot of Frank wearing his tactical gear, the iconic skull symbol emblazoned across his chest. As the heartless punk lies there, Frank draws his weapon with cold determination and fires a single shot directly into the face of the man who caused so much suffering to an innocent dog. With this final act of ultimate justice, the screen fades to black, making it crystal clear that the Punisher is back to restore order to a city that had spiraled into total anarchy.